The sky above the small town looked pale and tired, like it hadn't woken up properly that morning. A soft wind carried the smell of old brick buildings, car exhaust, and the faint scent of baked bread from a nearby shop that had already closed for the day. Along the sidewalk walked a young man with slow, heavy steps, each one showing how worn out he truly was. His clothes weren't torn, but they looked washed too many times, the color fading in uneven patches. His dark hair stuck to his forehead from the long hours he'd spent walking, and the strap of a beat-up violin case dug into his shoulder. His name was Elias, though nobody in this town knew that yet. If they had looked closely, they might have guessed something about him, maybe that he was exhausted. Maybe that he had traveled far. Maybe that he had gone too long without a warm meal. But people rarely looked closely at strangers passing by. They had their own lives to worry about. Elias stopped in front of a small diner on the corner. The neon sign in the window flickered between two colors that didn't match, as if the sign itself was deciding whether to stay awake or give up for the night. A chalkboard out front read, "Home-style dinner special, served until close." When Elias pushed the door open, a soft bell chimed overhead, the sound gentle enough to make him pause. Inside, the diner smelled like fried onions, warm soup, and the kind of comfort only small-town places seem to have. A few customers were scattered across the booths, some finishing their meals, others sipping slowly as if delaying the end of the day. Elias took a breath and approached the counter, moving with a mix of hope and hesitation. Behind it stood a man wiping down the surface with a cloth. He looked up, eyebrows raised slightly at the sight of the weary traveler. "Evening," the man said, his tone friendly but tired. "Hi," Elias replied, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you still serving food?" The man nodded. "For a few more minutes. We're closing soon," Elias swallowed. He reached into his pocket, but all he found were a few coins, barely enough for a small cup of coffee, not nearly enough for a real meal. His stomach tightened painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. He had spent what little money he had on a cheap bus ticket, which ended up getting him only halfway to where he needed to go. He looked at the man behind the counter again, choosing his words carefully, hoping he wouldn't sound like someone looking for a handout. "I don't have enough money for a meal," he said quietly, "but I can play." The man blinked. "Play?" "My violin," Elias said, tapping the case hanging from his shoulder. If I could play a song, maybe I could earn a small plate of something, just enough for tonight." The man hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had seen plenty of unusual requests over the years, people offering to sweep the floor or wash dishes in exchange for a sandwich. But trading music for food? That one was new. Before the man could answer, a voice came from behind him. "What's going on out there?" A woman stepped into view, her apron dusted with flour and her hair tied back in a messy knot. She was the kind of person whose face carried both kindness and firmness at the same time. "He wants to play the violin for a meal," the man said. The woman looked at Elias, her eyes filled with curiosity rather than judgment. She studied him for a moment, the tired shoulders, the calm but hopeful expression, the violin case that looked older than he was. "What's your name?" she asked Elias. "Well, Elias," she said, "we don't usually trade performances for food, but—" She wiped her hands on her apron. "If you're willing to play something, I suppose there's no harm in listening. If the folks here enjoy it, you'll get your meal." Elias felt relief rush through him. It was small, but it mattered. "Thank you," he said, nodding gratefully. The woman waved a hand lightly toward the empty space near the front counter. "You can play over there. Nothing too long, we're almost closing." As Elias walked toward the space she pointed to, he felt the eyes of the customers follow him. A few whispered to one another. A couple of people smiled politely, clearly expecting something simple, maybe even funny. After all, most travelers coming into town with instruments were playing for spare change, not meals. Elias gently lowered the violin case to the floor and unlatched it. The hinges creaked softly when he opened it, revealing the instrument inside. It wasn't pretty. The body was scratched and scarred, the varnish worn thin in places. but it was clean, carefully cleaned. Lovingly maintained despite the wear, a man sitting at the counter leaned toward the woman behind it. "Think he's any good?" he whispered. She shrugged. "We'll find out in a minute." One of the teenagers in a far booth nudged his friend. "Bet he plays something funny," he snickered. Elias heard the whispers, but he didn't react. He was used to people expecting little from him. It never bothered him much. He wasn't playing to impress anyone, not really. He was playing because it was the only thing he could offer. He lifted the violin gently, treating it with more care than he gave to anything else he owned. Then he took out the bow, running his thumb along the worn wood. When the bow hair brushed lightly against his fingers, something like comfort settled in him. No matter how difficult things became, the instrument had always been there, steady, familiar. When he stood up straight, the room grew a little quieter. Not silent, but close. Even those who weren't interested couldn't help giving a quick glance. He placed the violin beneath his chin. The dim lights of the diner reflected faintly on its scratched surface. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to look dramatic, but simply because he needed to breathe, to center himself, to let the noise of the day fade. His fingers curled around the neck of the violin, finding their places without hesitation. His other hand lifted the bow, hovering above the strings. Most of the customers still expected something light, a folk tune. A street performer's melody, maybe even an unsteady beginner's attempt. But Elias wasn't thinking about their expectations. He was thinking about the long road behind him, the missed meals, the dreams that felt close enough to touch, yet always a little out of reach. He thought about the small audition he hoped to make it to, miles away. A chance he wasn't sure he could still reach. He drew in one more breath. Then he played. The first note floated out, soft but full, like warm air filling the quiet spaces of the diner. It wasn't loud or showy. It didn't need to be. It carried a depth that made the nearest customers look up instantly. A woman halfway through lifting a spoon froze, her eyes shifting toward the sound. Elias didn't open his eyes. He let the bow glide smoothly, each stroke steady and sure. The melody he chose was one he had written during a lonely evening months earlier, something gentle, something honest. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to speak. The whispering at the counter stopped. The teenager in the booth lowered his hand, the joke dying on his lips. Even the man cleaning dishes in the back leaned his head out to see what was happening. Elias' fingers moved with a confidence that didn't match his worn appearance. Every movement came from years of practice, late nights in empty community centers, quiet afternoons in library rooms where he pretended not to notice when staff peeked in. Curious about the boy with the old violin, the music grew slightly stronger, carrying a hint of sadness, then softened again, as if whispering something personal, something almost fragile. People listened without meaning to. Something about the sound seemed to reach into the tired corners of their minds. Touching places they didn't expect, the bow glided smoothly, like a voice telling a story without words. And though Elias didn't know what the listeners heard, he knew what he felt, years of trying, failing, rising again, and pushing forward just a little more each time for a moment. The diner wasn't a place closing for the night. It was a room held gently by the sound of a violin, every ear tuned in, every small noise forgotten, when the melody reached its soft ending. The final note held for just a heartbeat before fading into the stillness. Elias lowered the bow slowly. Only then did he open his eyes. The room was silent. No clattering dishes. No whispering. No forced chuckles. Just quiet. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough for Elias to notice that the faces looking back at him were not the same expressions he had seen before. The amusement was gone. The doubt had faded. In its place stood something he rarely received: real attention, real respect. He didn't know what would happen next. He only knew that for the first time that day. He didn't feel invisible. He finally felt seen. The diner stayed quiet for a few seconds after Elias finished playing, as if everyone needed a moment to understand what they had just heard. The last note still seemed to hang in the air, even though the bow had already come to rest at his side. Elias didn't know what to expect. He had played in many places over the years, street corners, bus stops, small parks, but the reactions were never the same. Some people just walked by. Some threw a coin without listening. Others smiled politely and kept going. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It felt heavy, like the whole room was processing something. Then a soft clatter broke the stillness. A fork slipped from someone's hand and hit a plate. It was enough to snap the moment, and the diner slowly came back to life. The woman behind the counter, who had been watching Elias with a thoughtful expression, stepped a little closer. Her voice wasn't loud, but in that quiet space, every word carried. "That was unexpected," she said. Elias lowered his head slightly, unsure if that was good or bad. "I hope it wasn't too much," he said quietly. "I can play something lighter if you prefer. Something shorter." The woman shook her head. No, it was beautiful. A few customers nodded. One older man dabbed at the corner of his eye, as if brushing away something caught there. Even the teenagers in the booth looked stunned, not embarrassed for him, but embarrassed for themselves, as if they regretted laughing earlier. The man behind the counter stepped forward too. "Kid," he said, though he clearly didn't mean it disrespectfully, "where did you learn to play like that? You sounded like someone who's been trained professionally for years." Elias didn't know how to answer that in a neat, simple way. He scratched the back of his neck and offered a small, almost shy smile. "I listened a lot," he said, "and practiced wherever I could. That's pretty much it." "Listening doesn't give you that kind of skill," one of the customers said. She sounded impressed, but also confused, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Elias didn't argue. He simply closed his violin case carefully, making sure the instrument was safe before he let out a quiet breath. He didn't want attention. He didn't want anyone to think he was better than he was. He just needed a meal. The woman behind the counter finally spoke again. "You earn more than a meal," she said. "Sit wherever you like. I'll bring something warm." "You look like you need it." Elias felt the tightness in his chest ease a little. "Thank you. Really." He walked to a booth near the window, sliding into the seat slowly, his body feeling heavier now that the adrenaline had faded. He rested his violin case beside him. The case looked so old and worn compared to the brightness of the diner lights, but he kept it close.
Almost protectively.
The woman brought him a plate of warm food, more than he expected. Not a small sample plate, but a full dinner with bread, vegetables, and a steaming bowl of soup on the side. She set it down gently, as if she didn't want to break the moment. "You don't have to rush," she said. "Eat as much as you need." Elias nodded gratefully. "This means a lot," he said. She gave him a brief smile. "Trust me. The pleasure is ours." As she walked back to the counter, a couple from one of the nearby booths stood up and approached Elias's table. They moved with the kind of confidence that made them seem slightly out of place in such a small diner. The woman from the pair spoke first. "Do you travel often with your instrument?" Elias swallowed a spoonful of soup before answering. "I travel when I have to, mostly for small performances or jobs. Sometimes I play outside shops, sometimes near bus stations. It depends." The man beside her leaned forward slightly. "Do you perform with any group or orchestra?" Elias shook his head. "No, I don't belong to any group. I've tried to audition, but things never line up. Travel is expensive, and most places want formal training or connections." The couple exchanged a quick look, one of those looks that said they were thinking the same thing. "You know," the man said, "we work with the regional orchestra a few towns over." Elias froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "You do?" he asked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Yes," the woman said. "I'm a coordinator there, and he's one of the directors. We've been with them for years." Elias blinked, stunned. He had planned to travel toward that area for an audition he wasn't sure he could afford to reach. But now two people from that very place were standing right in front of him, watching him with interest. "You have real talent," the woman said. "Not just skill. What you played there was heart in it. That's something you can't fake." Elias didn't know what to say. Compliments made him uncomfortable, not because he didn't appreciate them, but because he never knew how to respond without sounding awkward. "Thank you," he finally managed. The man continued. "We'd like to hear you play more. Would you be willing to come to the orchestra hall tomorrow morning? We can arrange a private audition. Nothing formal. Just you and us." Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't tell if this was real or something he had dreamed up on one of those long nights he spent practicing alone. "I'd like that," he said softly. "But I don't have money for travel yet. I was planning to earn some and then make my way there. It might take a few days." The couple shook their heads almost at the same time. "No need," the woman replied. "We can give you a ride in the morning. It's on our way. And we'll make sure you're taken care of when you get there. You shouldn't miss an opportunity because of something like transportation." Elias stared at them, unsure how to handle this sudden kindness. "Are you sure?" he asked. "We wouldn't offer if we weren't," the man said. Elias nodded slowly, still absorbing everything. Then, "Yes, thank you, truly." The woman gave him a warm smile. "Finish your meal. Get some rest. Tomorrow might be a big day for you." They returned to their table, leaving Elias sitting in silence, his mind racing. The meal in front of him was warm and comforting, but he barely tasted it now. His head was full of thoughts, hope mixing with uncertainty, excitement battling with fear. He wasn't used to opportunities appearing so suddenly. The woman behind the counter came by again, noticing the look on his face. "Everything all right?" she asked. Elias nodded, though his expression still looked a little overwhelmed. "I think so," he said. "It's just a lot." She smiled. "Good things can feel like that too, you know?" He looked up at her, appreciating the calm in her voice. "Thank you. For the food, for letting me play." "You didn't let us do anything," she said, waving a hand. "You gave this place something special tonight." A few minutes later, most of the customers started leaving as the closing time approached. The couple from the orchestra gave Elias a small wave before heading out. The teenagers left quietly, without the earlier giggles. The older man, who had teared up, gave Elias a small, respectful nod. When the diner finally emptied, the woman told Elias he could stay a little longer if he needed to warm up. She even brought him a cup of tea, the steam rising gently in the cool air of the near-closing room. "If you need somewhere safe to rest until morning," she said softly, "you're welcome to stay by the fireplace in the back. It's not much, but it's warm." Elias felt something settle inside him, something soft and grateful. "Thank you," he said again. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already did," she replied. "That music, it reminded me of why I opened this place in the first place." Elias didn't know what she meant exactly, but he could hear the sincerity in her voice. He finished his meal slowly, taking in the warmth of the room, the smell of the food, the quiet hum of the diner settling down for the night. The world outside felt cold and uncertain, but inside, the small corner of the diner felt almost safe when he finally gathered his violin and moved toward the back room by the fireplace. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The day had started with hunger and doubt. It was ending with kindness and the possibility of a future he had almost stopped believing in as he lay down beside the glowing warmth of the fire. He closed his eyes, holding his violin case against his chest. Tomorrow could change everything, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe it might. The fire in the back room of the diner crackled softly through the night, throwing warm light over the old bricks and giving the space a comfort that Elias hadn't felt in a long time. He slept lightly, the kind of sleep that comes after exhaustion has pushed a person to their limit. His violin case stayed against his chest as if protecting it protected him too. Every so often, the fire popped and shifted, but he didn't wake. When the morning sun finally eased its way through the small window above him, it cast a soft glow across the room. Elias stirred, blinking slowly as he adjusted to the new day. His body felt stiff from sleeping on the floor, but his mind felt strangely clear. For the first time in weeks, he had slept somewhere warm and safe. He sat up quietly and rubbed his hands together, warming them near the dying embers of the fireplace. The smell of coffee drifted in from the diner's kitchen. He heard the distant clinking of someone preparing for the day. He checked the time on the wall clock. It was still early, barely past sunrise. After stretching his back and checking his violin carefully, He stood. He brushed the dust from his shirt and made sure he looked as presentable as possible. He didn't have fancy clothes. Everything he owned fit inside his backpack. But he still wanted to show respect. When he stepped out into the main area of the diner, the woman who had helped him the night before was already behind the counter. She looked up as soon as she heard his footsteps. Morning. She greeted with a small smile. Good morning, Elias replied. Thank you again. For letting me stay here? You're welcome, she said. How did you sleep? Well, he answered honestly. Better than I have in a long time. She nodded, pleased. Sit down. I'll get you something to eat before your ride gets here. Before he could protest, she had already turned toward the kitchen, moving with the ease of someone who had been running the place for many years. Elias sat at a booth near the window. Outside, a few early morning workers crossed the street, and a couple of cars rolled slowly through the quiet town. The woman returned with a simple breakfast: eggs, toast, and a small bowl of fruit. Eat up, she said. You'll need your strength today. Elias felt a mix of nerves and hope. Do you think they really meant it? He asked. About the audition? The woman sat across from him for a moment, resting her hands on the table. I think people don't make offers like that unless they're serious, she said kindly. They saw something in you. You just have to show them you're ready. Elias nodded slowly. He wanted to believe that. He really did. He finished his food quietly, sipping the warm tea she brought afterward. Each minute felt longer than the last. He checked his violin again, tightening the bow hair slightly, making sure the bridge was aligned. He wiped the rosin dust from the strings gently. Taking care of his instrument always brought him a strange peace, as if each small adjustment helped steady his mind. A few minutes later, the bell above the diner door rang softly. Elias looked up. The same couple from the night before stepped inside. They were dressed neatly, looking ready for the day ahead. The woman smiled warmly when she saw Elias. Good morning, she said. Are you ready? Elias stood quickly. Yes. Thank you again for offering to help. The man stepped forward. It's no trouble at all. We're glad to have you join us. The woman behind the counter nodded toward Elias. Good luck today, she said. Remember, just play with the same heart you played with last night? Elias gave her a grateful smile. I will. Thank you for everything. With his violin carefully strapped over his shoulder, he followed the couple outside. The morning air was cool, the sky a soft blue with thin clouds drifting lazily above. The town was just beginning to wake up, sidewalks still mostly empty. The couple led him to a clean, simple car parked along the curb. The man opened the back door for Elias. Make yourself comfortable, said. Elias climbed inside, placing the violin case gently across his lap. As the engine started and the car pulled away from the diner, he turned to look out the window. The small town seemed even quieter than the night before, the shops just beginning to open. The air fresh and still. The woman in the passenger seat turned slightly to face him. I hope you're not too nervous, she said. I'm a little nervous, Elias admitted, but I'm excited too. I've tried to audition before. Things just never worked out. Well, the man said from the driver's seat, today is a new chance. Don't think about the past. Just focus on what you can do. The ride was peaceful, the scenery outside slowly shifting from small-town streets to wider roads lined with tall trees. Morning sunlight filtered through the branches, casting moving patterns across the car seats. Elias watched quietly, letting the calmness settle him. After some time, the woman spoke again. Can I ask you something? Elias nodded. Sure. How long have you been playing the violin? Well, he thought for a moment. Since I was about 9, he said. I found an old violin at a thrift store. It was cheap, and it didn't sound good at first, but I loved it right away. I saved up money to repair it little by little. The man smiled. That takes a lot of dedication. Elias shrugged lightly. I didn't really have anyone to teach me, so I learned by listening. I would play recordings and try to copy the sound. Sometimes I'd borrow books from the library and study them even if I didn't understand everything. The woman's eyes softened. That explains why your playing sounds so emotional. People who learn that way often play from the heart, not just the notes. Elias felt warmth rise in his chest at her words. Compliments still felt unfamiliar, like clothes that didn't quite fit yet, but he appreciated them deeply. They drove for another half hour before the buildings began to look different. The town grew larger, more modern. Stores, cafes, and offices lined the streets. People hurried along the sidewalks, each carrying their own morning routines. Soon the car turned onto a quieter road, surrounded by tall trees and open lawns. At the end of the street stood a large brick building with wide windows and a tall entrance. Elias recognized the design immediately. He had seen pictures of places like it before: concert halls, music centers, places where people dreamed of performing. "We're here," the man said as he parked the car. Elias stepped out slowly, taking in the size of the building. It wasn't enormous, but it carried a presence, a sense of purpose. He tightened his grip on the violin case strap. They walked up the steps together. The woman pushed open the glass door, and a cool breath of air greeted them inside. The lobby was quiet, clean, and filled with soft morning light. Posters of past performances lined the walls, colorful images of orchestras, soloists, and special events. Elias's heart beat a little faster. The woman gestured toward a hallway. "We can use one of the private rehearsal rooms. It's quiet this early in the day." They walked down a long corridor, where faint echoes of distant instruments could sometimes be heard. Someone practicing scales on a flute. Someone warming up with a rhythmic tapping on a drum. Even though the building was mostly empty, the air seemed full of potential. When they reached a small rehearsal room, the man opened the door. Inside, the space was simple but well maintained. There were 2 chairs, a music stand, and a small table in the corner. The walls were designed to soften sound, giving the room a warm, controlled atmosphere. "This will do," the man said. "Take your time to get settled." Elias nodded. He placed his violin case on one of the chairs and carefully opened it. The couple watched with patient curiosity, wanting to see how he prepared himself. He tuned the strings quietly, listening closely to each pitch. His fingers moved with familiarity, guided by years of habit. Then he tightened the bow and applied a small amount of rosin. Tapping off the excess powder, when he stood up straight, he breathed in slowly, then out. The woman smiled at him encouragingly. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Elias lifted the violin to his chin. This room felt different from the diner quieter, more serious. He could almost feel the weight of the walls, the history of musicians who had played here before. He didn't want to disappoint the couple who had helped him, didn't want to disappoint himself. He closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of the fire in the diner, the warm meal, the unexpected kindness, the miles he had traveled. He thought of how hard he had worked for so many years without knowing whether any of it would lead anywhere. He opened his eyes, then he played. The first notes flowed gently through the small room, filling it with a calm that felt almost like morning air. The couple leaned forward unconsciously, drawn into the sound. Elias played the same piece from the diner, but here, in this space built for music, every note carried even more depth. The room seemed to embrace the sound, letting it bloom naturally. His bow moved with steady confidence. His fingers danced across the fingerboard, shaping the melody with tenderness and control. He wasn't trying to impress them. He wasn't thinking about earning anything. He was simply telling his story the only way he knew how. When he reached the softer part of the melody, the woman placed a hand over her heart. The man's expression shifted, his eyebrows lifting slightly as if hearing something rare. The final note lingered beautifully, hanging in the air like a breath that didn't want to leave. Elias lowered the violin. The couple didn't speak at first. They needed a moment. Finally, the man exhaled. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. Elias looked down, unsure what to do with the compliment. "You have something special," the woman added softly. "Something we don't hear often, even with trained musicians." Elias wasn't sure what to say. "Thank you," he whispered. The man stepped closer. "Would you be willing to play another piece? Something you're comfortable with?" Elias nodded and adjusted his posture. He played a second piece, this one more lively, more energetic, filled with quick movements and bright tones. It showed a different side of him, a part that loved music, not just for expression, but for joy. When he finished, the man spoke again. At a moment the music faded. The diner seemed to exhale all at once, as if the entire room had been holding its breath without realizing it. A few forks clinked against plates. Someone sniffed quietly near the back booth, and the owner stood, frozen behind the counter with a dish towel hanging from her hand. It was as if every person inside the diner had been lifted out of their normal world and dropped into some quiet place where only the sound of the violin existed. Even after the final note, that feeling stayed, floating in the air like warmth left behind by the sun. The young musician lowered his violin slowly, unsure of what to do next. He didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't even glance around for applause. For a moment, he actually looked embarrassed, as if he had done too much and wasn't sure if he should apologize. He gently placed the violin back in its case, treating it with the same careful touch someone might use on a fragile piece of glass. A man in a wool coat was the first to speak, though his voice cracked slightly. He wasn't someone who looked easily moved, but right now he was blinking more than usual. He asked the young musician where he had learned to play like that. The musician hesitated, then admitted he had never gone to any formal music school. He had grown up listening to old recordings borrowed from libraries, copying every note until he could play them from memory. He had played anywhere he could: community centers, street corners, small church halls, when someone left the door unlocked, and sometimes in basements of buildings where the echo made everything sound a little more beautiful. As he spoke, the owner of the diner stepped closer, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. She had seen countless travelers come and go, some hopeful, some lost, some carrying more stories than luggage, but none had ever walked into her place and played something like this. She asked him why he had never attempted to join an orchestra or audition somewhere proper. He shrugged lightly, said that life had always seemed to pull him in different directions. Money was tight. Opportunities were rare. And whenever he did gather the courage to try, something always got in the way: a late bus, a broken string, a day where he couldn't bring himself to believe he was good enough. A couple sitting near the front booth exchanged a look. They had been listening just as closely as everyone else, but unlike the others, they recognized something instantly. They worked with a regional orchestra, one as a coordinator, the other as a part-time music coach. They had heard dozens, maybe even hundreds of violinists over the years. But this young man's playing stood out like a bright flame in a dark room. The woman from the booth leaned forward and asked him if he had ever auditioned for their orchestra. He shook his head, saying he had planned to try that very week, but had gotten stranded when he missed his connecting bus. His money had run out shortly after, and he had been wandering, hoping to find food and a little rest before figuring out what to do next. Both of them sat up straight when they heard this. They introduced themselves and explained where they worked. The young musician looked surprised at first, then almost doubtful, as if he wasn't sure whether he should believe them. But their expressions were sincere, and their eyes carried the kind of recognition only people familiar with talent could have. The man from the booth told him, without hesitation, that he should audition. Not next week, not eventually tomorrow. He said the orchestra had been searching for someone with genuine emotion, someone who could bring heart into every note. And what he had just done inside that diner was more than enough proof. The musician's hands trembled slightly. He wasn't used to praise. He wasn't used to being wanted. His life had been filled with long days, empty stomachs, and quiet corners where he practiced until his fingertips burned. Now, suddenly, people who understood music were telling him he was special. It felt unreal. The owner stepped closer again and asked if he had a place to stay for the night. He admitted he didn't. He had planned to sleep at the bus station, but it had been closed early due to cold weather. Without hesitating, she insisted he stay in the diner. They kept an old cushioned bench near the fireplace, and she said it wasn't much, but it was warm. She also said that any musician who could make her forget she had bills to pay for 5 whole minutes deserved a safe place to sleep. He smiled. The first real smile he had shown since entering the diner. It was small and tired, but filled with gratitude. The owner motioned for him to sit back down and let her bring him another plate of food. This time, it wasn't in exchange for anything. She simply wanted to do it. The couple from the booth stayed a little longer, asking questions about his background, his travels, and what kind of pieces he loved to play most. He answered shyly but honestly. He told them how he used to imagine big stages when he practiced, even if his real surroundings were nothing more than cracked walls or narrow stairwells. He shared memories of people who had encouraged him. Even in small ways, an old neighbor who once gave him a pack of new strings. A librarian who let him sit in the back room so he could practice without disturbing anyone. The more he spoke, the more the people around him realized how much music meant to him. It wasn't something he did for attention or applause. It was something he lived for. Something that kept him going even on the hardest days. As the night went on, the diner grew quieter. A few customers left, but not without stopping by to thank him or wish him luck. Some slipped small bills into his violin case when they thought he wasn't looking. Others simply nodded with the kind of respect normally reserved for someone who had endured far more than he ever let on. The musician looked around, overwhelmed by the kindness. He wasn't used to rooms filled with warmth, but tonight it felt like he belonged there, even if just for a moment. When the diner finally closed for the night, the owner dimmed the lights and guided him to the cushioned bench near the fireplace. The heat from the flames wrapped around the room in a gentle glow, making everything feel softer. She brought him a blanket and told him to rest, assuring him that he was safe here. He lay down slowly, the events of the night swirling in his mind. A few hours earlier, he had walked in with little more than hope and hunger. Now he had a warm meal in his stomach, a place to sleep, and the promise of an opportunity he had spent years dreaming about. He placed his violin case beside him, resting his hand on top of it as if it were an old friend. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for once he felt something close to certainty, not that life would be easy, but that he might finally be moving toward something better. As his eyes grew heavy, he whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. Maybe to the owner, maybe to the couple, maybe to the world for giving him one night of warmth. And with that thought, he drifted into sleep, ready for whatever waited for him when the sun rose again. The first light of morning slipped through the diner windows, stretching across the floor in soft golden lines. The young musician woke slowly, blinking at the warm glow that settled on his face. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. He had slept so deeply that waking up felt strange, as if he had stepped out of a dream and into a place he didn't recognize. But then he saw the small fireplace, the empty tables, the worn bench beneath him, and the familiar shape of his violin case resting by his feet, and everything came back. He sat up carefully, stretching his stiff shoulders. The blanket the owner had given him had slipped halfway onto the floor, and he folded it neatly before standing. The diner was quiet, but not empty. The owner was already behind the counter, preparing for the morning rush, moving around with the steady rhythm of someone who had done the same thing every day for years. When she turned and saw him awake, she smiled warmly. She asked how he had slept, and he answered, honestly, it was the best sleep he had had in a long time. She laughed gently and said the old bench had never earned a compliment before. She brought him a plate of breakfast without being asked. It wasn't fancy eggs toast and a small bowl of fruit, but it looked almost too good to be real. He thanked her more times than necessary, but she waved him off, pretending not to notice how grateful he truly was. While he ate, the couple from the night before walked through the diner's front door. They looked bright and awake, dressed neatly and ready for the day. They greeted the owner before turning toward him. He felt a wave of nerves wash over him. Their offer from the night before had felt surreal, like something that might disappear in the morning light. But here they were, just as they promised. Smiling at him, as if everything they'd said was still true, they asked him if he was ready. He swallowed, nodded, and closed his violin case with careful fingers. The owner wished him luck and told him she expected to hear the whole story when he returned. He promised he would come back. Stepping outside, the cool morning air hit his face, refreshing and sharp. The couple led him to their car, and he climbed in, setting the violin on his lap as if it were something fragile. The drive was quiet at first, but not in an uncomfortable way. He watched the town pass by, each building glowing softly under the early sun. It felt peaceful, as if the world had paused just long enough for him to breathe. The couple told him about the audition, how it would work, who he would meet, and what he should expect. They assured him he didn't have to be perfect. They just wanted him to play like he had played the night before. with heart. With honesty, when they reached the orchestra hall, his breath caught slightly. The building was larger than anything he had ever imagined walking into. Tall glass windows reflected the sky, and the entrance looked grand, like a gateway to something bigger than his old life. Inside, the hall was quiet but full of presence, as if countless notes still lingered from past performances. They led him into a small rehearsal room where a few people were waiting, an older conductor with kind eyes, a woman with a clipboard, and two musicians tuning their instruments. He felt the weight of all their attention settle on him. His hands trembled again. But he took a slow breath and reminded himself why he was here. The conductor greeted him warmly and asked him to play whenever he felt ready. No pressure, no rush. The room settled into silence. He opened his violin case. The instrument shimmered softly in the overhead light, its scratches and worn edges suddenly looking less like flaws and more like proof of every step he had taken to reach this moment. He lifted it to his shoulder. He closed his eyes. And then he played. The first note spread through the room with the same depth and warmth it had carried the night before. But this time, something felt different. Something inside him opened, something he had kept locked away for years out of fear, doubt, and survival. The music flowed out of him like a story he had never been able to tell with words. He played the piece he had written during one of the loneliest times of his life. Back when he used to hide in a stairwell of an old building where the echo made everything feel less empty. He had written it for himself, for the quiet moments when he needed to feel like he still had something left, inside worth holding on to. Now he let that story fill the room when he finished. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It felt full, like the air itself had shifted. The conductor stepped forward slowly, studying him with a soft expression. He didn't speak right away, which made the young musician nervous. But when he finally did, his words were calm and certain. He said the musician had something rare, something that couldn't be taught, no matter how many years someone spent in school. He had emotion. He had truth. And those were the things that brought music to life. The woman with the clipboard nodded, writing something quickly. The other musicians exchanged glances, pressed. Then the conductor asked him a simple question. Would he consider joining the orchestra? The musician froze. He had imagined this moment for so long that hearing the words out loud felt unreal. His throat tightened, and he managed a shaky yes. The couple smiled, relieved and proud. It was clear they had believed in him from the moment they heard him play. The conductor shook his hand and told him they would help him get settled housing, meals, transportation, whatever he needed for the first few weeks. They wanted him focused on the music, not on survival. The musician didn't know what to say. Everything inside him felt too big to fit into a single sentence. So he simply thanked them, over and over, hoping they understood how much this meant. After the audition and introductions, the couple drove him back to town so he could gather his things and say goodbye to the owner. On the ride, he stared out the window again, but this time the world looked different, brighter, more open. Like someone had lifted a weight off his shoulders he didn't realize he had been carrying. When they reached the diner, the owner was waiting at the door, pretending she hadn't been standing there for several minutes. She asked how it went, trying to sound casual, but her eyes gave away her curiosity. He smiled wide, and Raylan told her everything. Her reaction was immediate. She gasped, clapped her hands, and pulled him into a quick hug before stepping back and pretending she hadn't gotten emotional. She said she knew it the moment he touched that violin. Though everyone could tell, she was saying it out of pride, not truth. She brought out a small paper bag filled with food, insisting he'd take it with him, even though he tried to refuse. She told him it was a good luck lunch, something she wanted him to remember her diner by. He promised he would visit again soon. The couple helped him into the car again, and as they drove away, he looked back at the diner growing smaller in the distance. The warm yellow lights inside glowed faintly through the windows. It hit him then that this little place, this unexpected stop, had changed everything for him. He turned forward again, holding his violin case close. The road ahead wasn't perfect or certain, but for the first time it felt like a road he belonged on, as sunlight filled the sky. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope, and with that, his new beginning truly began.